Hello, everyone. My name is Rich Martin, Senior Technical Marketing Engineer at Itential. And here I am joined with me today for our joint session with Jordan Villareal. Jordan, give everybody a second and introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, Rich. Thanks for the quick intro there. So my name's Jordan Villareal. I'm a technical advocate for NetBox here at NS1. I've been a network engineer for close to 22 years, and I'm super excited to be part of this and have helped bring NetBox into the Itential presentation.
Fantastic. So the question is, why are we here? Really, this is a joint demonstration. We're excited to work with you, especially in regards to how we can both help network teams to start automating using NetBox as a source of truth for the network. And then Itential as an automation platform and showing how we integrate. And really, it really starts with a simple question that I'm sure you get from your side, from customers or potential prospects. We get it from our side from customers and potential prospects is, where do we start with all of this?
Yeah, it is pretty common, and automation is, it's not very new, but it is still new for a lot of groups. And what I have found historically, like if we just go into the past, how automation, and I'm using the term automation very loosely here, started, at least for me, it was a notepad document. A text document said, okay, put this in and make sure you put these variables, change the IPs.
Right.
And then inevitably what happened is it got shared from engineer to engineer, and it got modified, and different engineers put their own, what they thought was the right config in there. And it just kind of spiraled out of control. And like automation for me, like basic automation is being able to get rid of those text documents and start bringing a more rigid, bring more rigor approach to implementing code like that. Just even the basic configurations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's notepad and copy and paste. Those are like the initial automation tools for most networking practitioners. When we get this question, everybody has a different set of skill sets, a different approach to things. I always take the approach of getting started simple. I think when you're looking at NetBox, it's really about how do we start to get organized with network devices, inventory, locations, things like that. And then as you start to branch out and build automations, just start simple, start basic. We recognize, you got to build trust and confidence, not just in the automation, but in the team's ability to leverage the platform, the tools, understand the data. And so start simple and then kind of advance it over time. And with understanding that even some of the simplest of automations can lend you a lot of efficiency and give you back a lot of time and make the network much more standardized and healthy, I guess you could say. And that's exactly what we're really going to talk about here as we address some of these persistent problems that most networking teams face today when it comes to how do we manage our network and what are our network elements and devices look like as far as configuration standardization.
Yeah, absolutely. And just speaking from experience, very recently, I was at a deployment that was around 55 sites globally. And I was walking in just trying to orient myself. And one of the first things I noticed was that we had, I believe it's somewhere between 3 and 4 different SNMP strings used just across
Right.
all the sites, all the different organizational units. And unfortunately, the one that was common between all of them was just the default public SNMP string. And that's what we started to use. So that was kind of how I started small most recently, was a simple task. It's all right, do I have the right SNMP strings everywhere for monitoring? It was for monitoring to make sure that we could get the right information out. So that was a good basic intro start into automation for me.
Yeah, I think that's really, for a number of reasons, that is a great place to start. It's kind of low hanging fruit because this is a persistent problem many organizations have. It's not a problem with not knowing what things ought to be configured as, but like you mentioned, over time things change. Things don't get updated like they should. And even simple things like SNMP, community strings, the correct IP address for log servers, time servers, DNS servers on networking devices don't typically cause problems until you actually need those services as part of like troubleshooting.
That's when you find out that's it seems to
Right.
work that way. Is I didn't have the right syslog server or buffer set until the day after there was a crash. Then I found out it was wrong.
Right. And that's when the pains really starts. So
It is.
being able to do something like that, because they aren't like these kind of configurations aren't, going to cause massive issues on the network when you start making them necessarily. So again, they're kind of low hanging fruit, but they're nonetheless very, very important. And we look at it as, if you can do this amount of automation, that kind of allows you to go from your crawl, to your step to your run, and looking at it that way. That's kind of the advancing over time that we're looking at. So so let's start with NetBox as a way to organize your inventory. And what might, what may be new to some folks or not, or maybe not, is to also use that organization and hierarchy that's available there as you start using NetBox, creating the organization, creating devices, and applying them to that organization and hierarchy. How you can actually leverage that to create configuration standards, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Is building in NetBox gives you a lot of flexibility that can now be leveraged in our automation platform through our integration, and then as we build automation workflows.
Yeah, that sounds great. I've had a sneak preview. I'm looking forward to seeing the entire demo, though.
Awesome.
Let's go.
All right. I'm going to use you as my sounding block here. Can you see my screen?
Yeah. Traditional video conferencing coming through loud and clear.
Yep. So we're just going to start here right at NetBox, because what we want to do is show kind of where you can get started with NetBox and where this leads to. So I think for me, having built out this demo and starting with NetBox, it helped to understand some of the organizational hierarchy that's available within the solution. And I started with regions, right? So if I was building out kind of what my network looks like, maybe I start with, the regions that I have that exist. I'm starting here with an East and a West region. I live in Atlanta, so I'm going to use Atlanta as the example here. But under West region, you can see that I've also built out, sites under that. And we'll get to that in a minute. But on the West, I have, let's say, a site in Los Angeles and San Francisco, maybe some data centers, some offices. I'm going to be preference to the East Coast here, because I live in Atlanta, and that does lead us to the site. So let's say now I have a site in Atlanta where we are located and I live, but also New York City. So as we create regions, then I can define sites. And I think there is a lot of flexibility in the NetBox platform to really build this out as it makes sense for any particular organization.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. NetBox doesn't try to be overly prescriptive in the way that you build this out, because it's pretty obvious not every organization is the same. So you build the regions as they make sense, the site groups as they make sense.
Yep. And then as I was building out the organizational hierarchy, it takes me to locations where I can now build, in this case, I'm saying, hey, I have a data center in Atlanta that's located downtown. I have a data center kind of in North Atlanta. We have our office in Midtown, and then I filled out some other elements for data centers in New York and San Francisco as well. So now I'm starting to build out this hierarchy of where all of my sites and locations are. And that really starts to lend to, okay, what do we do next? So my next step was, since I've built out that hierarchy, what about devices? How does devices kind of, interact with now this hierarchy? So as I started to build out devices, and if I go to the device list here, I'll pick this one, Core ATL1. Now, as I created it, we'll create one in a minute, I have the ability to identify the appropriate region, right? The appropriate site that I've predefined, as well as the actual location. And of course, this just lends itself to just good organization. As network teams need to understand, like physically network devices, where are they located? This is helpful. But what's really cool about this is that actually, once you bring in the idea of the feature of config contexts, this opens up kind of a whole new door of the things you can do as far as not just identifying where devices are, but building standardization based off of their geographic location.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that just kind of speaking to NetBox a little bit more at large, when you start getting into the nesting or the hierarchy of how things fall together, it gets it's very natural to navigate. It makes a lot of sense.
Okay. Yeah, it does. So let me push over here to the config context, because I want to briefly cover that so we get a good understanding of what we mean by that. So config context allows us to, and you can correct me if my terminology is off here, but allows us to define some free-form data. And I like to think of it as variables, because that's literally what we're going to be using these as. Some free-form data. I have it here expressed as a JSON object, which is very nice for us because our Itential platform is native JSON. But as I define this freeform data, I have the ability now to assign it to not only the regions, to sites, locations. We're just using 3 of those in this example, but quite a number of fields here it can be assigned to, along with a weight.
Yeah, the weight can come into play a lot of different ways when you have contesting or similar, or if you need to supersede data that's in there. Like if you're changing out the SNMP community, you can insert a higher weighted one, and that will take preference when that configuration gets generated, which I think we're going to see in a couple screens how that gets generated and pulled together.
So what we did here is just thinking this through. Let's say region East, of course, I have site Atlanta and New York, and then locations under those. If we start at the upper level, the region, what we're doing here is we're assigning this bit of data, which happens to be an SNMP community. That will be part of a config standard for, in this case, all devices that exist in the Eastern region. If we go back, I've also defined a config context that is now assigned to a site. So now this particular piece of data defines a variable that identifies the appropriate syslog server that I want to be part of a standardized configuration. Now, specifically for devices in Atlanta, if I created another config context and applied it to New York City, then I could specify a syslog server that was unique for devices that exist in New York City as part of their standardized configuration.
Yeah, and for syslog, I've seen that be helpful, where you have a local forwarder, more or less, and then they all come upstream to a central point where they all get ingested, and you can do your correlation. So, yeah, the local syslog servers make a lot of sense.
Yep. And then finally, I've created 3 unique, since I have 3 unique locations, I've created 3 unique config contexts to apply to those. We'll just look at one here, but they're all unique, right? So now I'm saying in these particular locations in Atlanta, I want to specify, a high performing NTP server that, it's probably on the network there. And that I want to keep unique between all my different sites. I'm going to deploy precision network time servers there, and I'm going to use those specifically.
Yeah, you don't want drift when you need precision in time.
Right. If we're gonna be organized, let's be organized.
That's right.
Okay, so here's the neat part. The really neat part is if I now, since I've created these devices and assigned them not just to the organizational hierarchy, which I have, but because the config contexts are tied to these different levels, what NetBox does is it renders them into a single JSON object that is now associated with that particular device. So in this case, you can see that at every one of those levels, we've merged all those details together, so that I have one object that has all the variables that are specific to those particular regions, sites, and locations. And go ahead.
I was going to say, wouldn't it be nice now if we had a way to push that into the appropriate places?
We do. But one of the things I did want to mention before we pop over to the demo is that one of the features of this is to be able to reference the same variable name. Since this is a JSON object, we'd say this is the key and this is the value in any of those contexts, those hierarchical contexts. And based off of the weight, it can override it's going to use the highest weight on those. So there's a lot of back-end intelligence that's being used to render these config contexts to give you a lot of flexibility in not only how you want to define specific standardization components based off of their location or their type, but also being able to change things over time. Like you said, hey, we need to rotate our SNMP community. If I change it here, it immediately becomes part of the new standard for all the devices under it.
Yeah, and it's just as easy as adjusting that weight and then, making sure that it's still tagged for the right region or the site or however you need to organize it. But yeah, it does become relatively trivial to make sure that you have the new data more or less in front of the old data. And it still lets you use the old data if you need to, just based on how you're grouping it within each of those regions, sites, device types, however you want to sort it.
So even this just gets you started very, very quickly. Not just in an organizational way of like what our inventory looks like and where it exists, but also now we can start to build those definitions. But the key here is you still need automation to help you take this data and do something with it. So with that, we'll go into the Itential platform. And I say start simple, and there's nothing simpler than a single step in an automation. So I want to start simple. So what you'll see here is NetBox we've got integrations and adapters that allow our Itential platform to integrate with all kinds of different IT systems, all kinds of types of networks, cloud, traditional on-prem devices, SD-WAN with controllers. Our whole point is to integrate with not only everything that exists on the network in all its different iterations and domains, but also so many of the network processes, even to make a simple change, require data, source of truth data, right? It's like from NetBox, being able to open tickets before change is made. So Jira or ServiceNow, or even doing something like notifications in real time about what's going on when an automation's kicked off and run, especially in response to any kind of event or something like that. So integration with, Teams or Slack, things like that. So what we want to do is integrate with as much as possible so that network teams can start to build not just the network change automation, but everything around it too, because that's where you're going to get the greatest efficiencies. But you start with very, very simple stuff, and then you build on and get more advanced as you go. So in this case, we've onboarded the NetBox adapter, which gives us access into all of the API calls that are available through the NetBox API. And of course, there's quite a few of them because, it's a very robust API, and there's a lot we can do here. But to get started simply, it's okay. We've defined a subset of devices. Maybe this is not all our devices, but we've created some organization. I've created a subset of a couple of devices in my inventory on NetBox. How do I get a list of those devices? That's where we want to start, because if we want to do anything with the devices and the configurations on those devices that we've set up in the config context, we need to get the list of those devices and those details. So that's really what this does. It's get DCIM devices. If I double click it, let me reload here. See, I didn't restart my browser, so. All right, if I double click it here, you'll see that I have a lot of options that can be used to pass data into the API call. So for the moment, I'm not going to use any of those options, because what I want to do is I just want to strictly run this as is. And this is easy as dragging and dropping an element from the right side under NetBox and dropping it on our canvas to start building an automation. So I can start this, and then we can view the job as it's running. And what you'll see here is it'll immediately complete because it's a single API call. And we can take a look at the data that was returned from this NetBox API call. So remember, this is kind of analogous to, if I go into, we can do it right now. If I go back to NetBox, I go to devices, and it gives me the full device list. It's kind of analogous to that. I just want the full device list. And you can see I have 4 devices that I have defined in our NetBox here. So if I go back into the completed job, I can see the data that was returned back from NetBox from that single call. And you'll notice all of this data that's returned, there's a lot of data. Most of it not necessarily useful for this particular automation, but in the future it could be. That data is there, and it can be extracted and utilized in the platform. You'll notice here that it gives us a field called count in the response data, and there are 4 elements. So that immediately gives us an idea of, okay, that's exactly what we saw when I looked in the kind of the dashboard view of NetBox. And then it gives us a list of those elements, Core ATL1, so that's one of my Atlanta routers, and all of the details that are associated with it. Now, of primary importance here is that config context that was rendered inside the platform. When I do an API call, it's rendered and fed to us through these outgoing variables. So now the automation has access to that, and we're going to use that in a moment. Our second ID or device here is Core ATL2. It has the same types of information, but you'll also notice that as we continue to go down, like here's ID4, which is a device in New York, right, in Manhattan. Let's say I want to start small and I don't want all of those devices, especially if I only have 4 here for testing and demo. But what if I had hundreds of devices and I want to start my automation small, right, in simple steps? One of the things you can do is if I go back to the simple one-step automation, if I double click it here, these variables that can get passed back into NetBox when I do this query for those devices, I can actually reduce the amount of devices, because think of it like a filter. When you're using NetBox, I can filter by site Atlanta, right, or region East, and I'm doing the exact same thing here. I can fill out region East because this is part of the API values that are available to me from NetBox, and this will help me reduce the devices to a very specific set. So if I do this, save it, rerun it.
And when you save that, you're adjusting your API query. Like that's you're
correct.
Adding those tags into that request.
Correct. And then we can look at the outgoing variables. Actually, we'll show you the incoming. So this is the data that was passed into NetBox through that API call. You'll see now I have those 2 fields that I filled out. And the outgoing data now gives me a count of 2. So NetBox is actually doing the filtering, if you will, for me, and only giving me the data that I really want in this case. So now I just have my 2 devices that match region East and site Atlanta. So Core ATL 1 and 2 is what I have here now.
Nice.
All right, so that's starting with your crawl. Maybe a crawl and a half is our next step. We're going to add a little bit more. So here's our initial first step, our first crawl rather. And now I've added a little bit more because now we've extracted a list, if you will, or an array of the devices that are applicable to the automation that I want to do here. The first thing that I would do as a network engineer, because I have to build trust and confidence in the automation, the tools, the data, like we talked about, is maybe I don't want to push configs yet. Maybe I want to just get an understanding based off of the new standards that I've created for, SNMP and logging and NTP. Based off of that, which devices are in or out of compliance? And that's really what I'm adding on here. So it's more of okay, we've got data now, we've got devices, and we've got the ability to, create some standardization. How do I now feed that into a way to create a config template and run a compliance report on these devices that we're getting from NetBox? And that's what we're doing here. So the data that comes out of here, like what we looked at a moment ago, is a lot of data. So I want to extract just the elements that I need to pass to some logic in this, and this is a for each loop. So I want to loop. I want to create a pathway that loops for every device that is in the list that is returned from our NetBox API call. So in this case, it's 2 devices, right? So the query here extracts just the data for those 2 devices into an array and passes it into this logic step, which just says, okay, now you've got 2 devices. So for each device in that array, execute these steps here. So these steps here now allow us to further refine the data that we're looking for. So now we've got, instead of the data for all 2 devices, now it's going to reduce the data to just that single device we're working on, because we're going to work on them sequentially. And so this is a data transformation. We call it a JST, JSON schema transformation, but really it's a data transformation. And what that does is it allows us to extract just the necessary elements from a lot of data into individual variables of different types, so that they can be used in subsequent tasks in the automation. So really, I'm taking the data that's here, reducing it to the necessary elements we need through this transformation step, so that I can feed it, so to speak, into this compliance report. And what a JST looks like as you build them, this follows our like no code methodology here, is on the left-hand side, there's a schema that defines the model, the model that's in a JSON schema format of the data that the API call to the NetBox get DCIM device returns. So the data is returned in this model, which makes it really easy for us now to extract just the things that I need out of all of that data, and it'll make them into outgoing variables or variables that can be used for subsequent tasks. In this case, the run compliance report. So what I need is I need the name of the device and all of those config context variables that we set up for to be rendered for a particular device in NetBox. So that's what I'm extracting here. And then finally, this is a run compliance report. It's part of our, it's a feature in our platform that allows you to create a compliance golden configuration tree, and then apply, in this case, we're going to create a config template that's going to use the data from that we extracted just a moment ago from the NetBox config context into that. So let me show you what that looks like here within our platform. So I'm in another area of our platform that's called Configuration Manager. This is where you build golden configuration trees. These are Cisco iOS devices, so I'm doing an iOS specific configuration here. So this becomes my golden config template, at least for these three particular elements, because these are the ones we've at least initially defined in NetBox that we want to create standardization around. So you'll notice it follows the Cisco iOS syntax, but here I'm defining a variable, right? In fact, 3 variables. Those variables are literally going to be replaced from the data that comes from every one of those config contexts for every one of those devices that's rendered by NetBox. So now we can start to not only build that config compliance template, but then we can also now run an automation that determines whether or not they are in or out of compliance. So we can audit those devices and see specifically what is or is not in line with what our new standards. So that's where those reports will show us here kind of in an overview. So let me pop back over to that. And with that overview, we can start to run this. And we can take a look at what it returns back to us. So again, I run it from here. By the way, as these are built out, they don't have to be, this is kind of the way you build things as you're kind of creating automations and workflows. Once they're completed, they can be run on a schedule. They can be triggered through an external API call. We have many different ways of publishing an automation or allowing it to run in a scheduled way. So you don't have to kick it off manually. But if you're just starting, this probably is something you want to do. So as that runs, we can visualize it here so we can see it in its stepwise format that we built it out. And you can see a lot, it's basically completed. So we'll walk through it because now that these tasks have been run, we can actually look at the live data that's been coming and going from each one of these steps. So this is the data that's coming in from the device, from the call into the NetBox API. This is where we got our count of 2 devices. That gets queried, extracted from here so that it can be passed to the for loop. The for loop then handles each one of the device and its data one at a time. Since we have 2 devices, you'll see that it's iterated through that for loop twice, so we can look at each one of those iterations. And then we can see we've extracted in the first iteration core ATL1 and its config context, and the second iteration core ATL2 in its config context. For each iteration, it passes that data back to this run compliance report. So we got both iterations here. And then once that is done, you'll see here the output of the config compliance report gives us the ability to programmatically determine if something passed or failed. So for the first one, the first device, core ATL1, it failed. Let's take a look at the second one. For the second one, it passed. So that completed the run of this next step. And if I go back to config manager here, I can do a quick refresh. And you'll see, based off of the report that was just run, this one passed, just like we saw, and this one did not. And again, we're kind of in that second step. We're advancing our way into more and more, complex automations that we feel comfortable with. So within our platform, we can actually now, I can view this compliance report. So I don't have to automate the changes, through an automated remediation. I can actually look at this and say, okay, this is not adhering to our new SNMP community. So I can now add that in this is not adhering to our NTP server, I can add that in. If I click apply, now it's actually going to remediate through our platform. Again, this is a type of automation, but it's a different type of automation. It's just being able to put some eyes and understanding on things so that you can continue to click a button and get this remediated.
So to my earlier SNMP problem, I could have queried my entire deployment, known what I needed the standard to be, and then sort of fixed it within button clicks here.
Correct. So while that's pushing, updating that configuration, that's going to eventually come back as compliant when we run another compliance audit check on it. But let's move on to our third workflow here in demo. So this is kind of now maybe a little bit of running, maybe your first steps into running. We've added, you'll notice that everything up to this point is what we covered in this last demo. We've run the compliance report. Now we're going to take that further step into doing a remediation. So we added an eval here, which tests to see if the config compliance failed, because there's no sense in running a remediation if it passed. So if it's failed, that pushes that to this path here, which is a query to get a report ID from the report, the compliance report. This is part of our platform, so that anytime something fails a remediation check, not only do we detail what failed, but how to fix it as well. So now I can associate that report with the compliance run and remediate that device. And again, this is using the same so I showed you in our configuration manager how you could do this by clicking a few buttons and remediating. This is using the same functions kind of under the hood. So once you feel comfortable doing something like that in Configuration Manager, you're using the same features here in an automation. So again, allowing you to continue on as you feel comfortable and confident with your data and your automation itself and the tools that you have available to you. And then eventually I do another compliance report here just to show that everything will be compliant. So before I run that, what we can do now is we can actually, for the last part here, drop back to NetBox and let's add a new device to our inventory. So if I go here to add the device, the name of our device here in my Midtown office, Core ATL 0, it is a type router. I'm going to fill out all of the hardware descriptions, because really the critical thing here that allows us to now generate a config context for that is selecting the right region, site, and location. In this case, I'm going to say it's here at our headquarters in our Midtown office. I think that's all I need.
It should be.
Yep, I think that's all I need. Now that I've created that, I can go back to devices, and then we can see now that it's onboarded, it's in the right area. And if I go here, here's our config context that gets rendered. So now it's unique NTP servers 10.0.0.1, which was I defined earlier for this particular location. So now if I go back to Config Manager, we can see that the remediation is pushed. And what I want to do here is just kind of add that device into the tree so it can find it. Oops. When we do a compliance report, so now that Core ATL 0 now exists as part of this tree. So now it's going to have this config template available to it. And of course, all the variables that get rendered into the device API call. Okay, so with that now, what we should see is the first two devices that we had should now be both green and compliant, because we did a kind of a manual remediation on the one that failed in the second demo. And then this third one, since it's net new, it's actually going to be out of compliance, and then our auto remediation should kick in and put into a compliant state. So the first iteration, so we could take a look here. The first iteration of this compliance report, since it's live running, we can see that it's actually working on Core ATL 0. So this was the first element in the device list that was returned from the API call into NetBox. So this is the one we just added. Here's the config context that was created that becomes part of the variables that will now get rendered into the config compliance. And you can see here at the end of that config compliance check, it did fail that check. So that new device we added was not compliant. And there are more details we could go into if we went into further details of the report. But for this case, we're just going to say, okay, we feel comfortable in being able to do this now. So this particular step of remediating, we're just going to automate that. So now, even though that core ATL0 that I just added in was not compliant, now we're just going to go ahead and remediate it and bring it back into compliance based off of those 3 variables. So it's actually doing that push now to the config, and now it's going to run, it's finished that. So now it's going to run the compliance report on it to generate the newest state of its compliance, which should come back as 100% matching. So let's see. Now it's also going to run the other compliance reports on these. So it's probably doing core ATL1 next, but I want to go ahead and do a refresh while it's doing that and show that, yep, that's indeed what we've seen here. Core ATL0 is in compliance. And then that allows us now to leverage even this simplest of automations. We can now go back into NetBox, and like I said, it kind of opens the door for the ability to now do a whole lot more. Not even just adding devices to inventory, because they automatically get, the config context, and now they automatically become part of what can be run in a compliance check, but also adding more variables as part of, further config standardization. Like, these are kind of low hanging fruit, but there are other variables that can now be added to this, like DNS server, right?
Right. I've gone through radius to TACAX cutovers. You need to change that server out. You need to change that configuration, even because sometimes radius and TACAX configure differently. There's a lot of different ways that you can take the variables out of NetBox, which it's to me, it's kind of fun to think of it in that way, that it becomes this big variable engine for you to start plugging into different automations. It goes as far as you can imagine.
Oh, absolutely. I know we've kicked around some further ideas of what you could do with this, but at the very least, as you can see now, we've passed the compliance check on all of those, but at the very least, it shows how you can really get started quickly in NetBox, just doing basic organization, right? Getting a handle of all the stuff that we've got, but then taking the further step of building these config contexts, and then going into Itential, doing the integration with the get DCIM device details, and being able to now query specifically areas that we can now start building automations to. First, maybe just run the compliance report just to see where we're at. How much work do we have to do? Maybe start doing those manually, and then eventually getting to the point where you add a little bit more to start to remediate those things automatically. And then maybe at the end of the day or at the end of the week after this runs, you get a compliance report that you can just view. The network team can just look at and go, hey, this is, these are the things that happen. And, a lot of times if you watch, I know we did a demo, a webinar recently where I actually showed, the integration with things like ServiceNow and Slack. So I always look at that as, okay, now how do we now build even more efficiency into these, to these automations by adding those? But again, that becomes more of the run. Here we are, we've gotten from crawl to walk and started our run.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes sense to iterate. And even as we've shown through here, as you've gone through the demos, it makes sense to start just at a site. Start with a site, start with some small information, and then grow it whichever way makes more sense. Like, do you do more config management, or do you do the basic and you do it at a little bit larger scope? There's different ways to step more gradually into the process, but the idea that you can use the hierarchy in there to help you to control where you're actually making those touch points, that helps a lot. In that sometimes it's crawl, stand up, take one step, but yeah, it's all an iterative process.
That's right. That's right. Well, awesome. Well, thank you again for joining me on this session. Again, we hope it was very helpful for those who are here live, for those who will continue to see this as it plays out on demand. But at least it shows you the value and the power of being able to combine NetBox and its abilities and its features and functionalities, leverage some of these advanced things like the config context, and then even building simple demos that'll allow network teams to get a hold of, of kind of the low-hanging fruit. Let's get some config standardization going. And that really, catapults you into doing bigger and better automations.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. Take care, and we will see you later.
Thanks everyone.